and good evening, everyone. We're really delighted you could join us this evening for our November talk presented by Anna Forrest and Helena Loemans. And their title is What Can Archaeological Finds and the Close Inspection of Artifacts, specifically textiles, reveal about the past? So this talk will be in two halves. First, we will hear from the former National Trust curator, Anna Forrest, about the underfloor discoveries made during the reroofing project at Oxburgh Hall in Norfolk. Some of you may have visited Oxburgh, wonderful house, surrounded by a moat, and certainly worth a trip. And the finds that they unearthed ranged from fragments of late 16th century books to high status Elizabethan textiles. We will then learn from Helena how close weave analysis can add to our understanding of how textiles were made and their origins. So on behalf of both the Icon Textile and archaeological groups, we extend a warm welcome to both our speakers. And let me introduce them. Anna Forrest studied architectural history and medieval studies before working as a curator for the National Trust in the east of England for 19 years. She has now returned to academia to do a master's in building history at Cambridge University, inspired in part by her work at Oxburgh. For her final 3 years with the Trust, she worked exclusively at Oxburgh Hall as project curator for the £6 million building conservation project entitled Raise the Roof. And for this major project, she led an interdisciplinary research programme which shed new light on Oxburgh's structure, decoration, and social history. Helena Loemans is a former laboratory technician at Nijmegen University in the Netherlands. She studied jacquard design in Florence, including textile analysis, and has a long experience as a fine production weaver, working from her studio in Odomira in Portugal. She is also a weaving tutor involved in various European funded projects for rural development. Helena is founder of Lab O, a laboratory for the research and reconstruction of canvases of old master paintings. Her mission is to recover and share the knowledge of historic canvases and textile fragments. Anna and Helena, we can't wait to learn more. So I now hand over to you. How exciting.
Thank you very much, Ksenia, for that introduction. I'm just going to share my slides with everybody. So Ksenia's given a really good introduction. Thank you very much for that. So you know that the subject of my talk is going to be Oxburgh Hall and the amazing finds that we found underneath the floors there during the roof project. Now, many of you will know Oxburgh Hall, but for those of you who don't, this is a rather atmospheric photo that was taken not that long ago, and it's an amazing moated manor house in West Norfolk. It's been home to the Bedingfeld family for nearly 550 years, and Sir Edmund Bedingfeld moved his family seat from Bedingfield in Suffolk to Oxburgh in Norfolk when he inherited the estate in 1476. And we think that the house was built in around 1482, which is the date of a license to crenellate that was given to the family by Edward IV, which is a little bit like royal planning permission. So the date of that probably coincides with the completion of the house. And we think that at least part of it might contain evidence for reuse of an earlier structure that might have been on the site before the Bedingfelds arrived there. As you can see, it's made of brick, and its gatehouse is an absolute tour de force of late medieval brickwork. And the whole thing is a really overt display of wealth and status. It's a courtyard plan house, and until 1775, it had a fantastic great hall on its south side, which on the right-hand part of the slide is number 15 on the slide. And unfortunately, this great hall was pulled down in 1775 but was described as one of the best old Gothic halls in England. And the house has been in National Trust ownership since 1952, but the Bedingfeld family still live in one corner of the house. Sir Edmund Bedingfeld, who was the builder of Oxburgh Hall, was a rising star in the Tudor court, and he was knighted by Henry VII in 1487, and his son hosted a visit from Henry VII at Oxburgh in 1498. His son was also knighted, and the family held a number of very high-ranking positions in the royal court during the Tudor period. This gentleman is Sir Henry Bedingfeld, who succeeded in 1553, and he's really important to our understanding of the finds that I'm going to be talking about. It's very important to note that the Bedingfelds were and continue to be Catholics, and their faith has never wavered over the centuries. Sir Henry Bedingfeld, shown here, was one of the first people to declare Mary I Queen, and as she rode from Kenning Hall in Norfolk to Framlingham in Suffolk to raise her standard, he brought to her assistance 140 well-armed men, and she later entrusted him with a number of important roles, including acting as jailer to her half-sister, Princess Elizabeth, when she was kept under house arrest at Woodstock after she was accused of involvement in a plot against Mary. Elizabeth's reign were to prove pivotal for the Bedingfeld family, and in 1559, Sir Henry refused to sign her Act of Uniformity, which outlawed Mass and made it compulsory to attend a parish church for the Anglican service. And from then on, the family's fortunes shifted, and they began to be known as recusants, which literally translates as refusers. And Henry was in fact summoned before the Privy Council a number of times to answer questions about matters of religion. So we keep that in your mind as I show you some of the finds later on. So as Ksenia said, we've recently done an enormous roof project at Oxburgh, and it all started because in 2016, a 19th century dormer window literally slipped off the roof and crashed into the courtyard below. And we initially thought that we would simply be replacing a dormer window, but it became clear relatively early on in our survey work that in fact what we were looking at was a very large building conservation project which would address all of the roofs and all of the chimneys and all of the dormer windows. So while this building work was going on, I was lucky enough to be able to lead a research program that ran alongside it, because this was a fantastic opportunity to really get under the skin of a building of this age. So we commissioned paint analysis, wallpaper research, detailed building recording, historic graffiti recording, and underfloor archaeology. We knew that we would need to lift quite a lot of floorboards whilst we were working on the roof, and because of the age of the building, we felt there was a very high chance that we would find really significant objects underneath the floors, and this had happened previously at Knoll, for example. And we planned to train a team of volunteers to help us with this work. But just as we got to the point where we started lifting floorboards, the first national lockdown happened, and all of our volunteers had to leave site, and most of our paid staff were furloughed. So it was quite a difficult time. But fortunately, we had a freelance archaeologist working with us, Matt Champion, who agreed to stay with us and worked alone in the building, so that every time floors were lifted by the builders, he was there to carry out a fingertip search of what was revealed underneath, and to rescue and record any of the finds that he could easily get to. We were expecting to find these sorts of things. So you can see cigarette packets and stamps, scraps of paper, lots of pins. There's a slightly more unusual one there, which is a box of Terry's chocolates, which somebody seemed to have eaten completely and then hidden back under the floor again, so nobody knew they'd done it. But we did find a lot of much more significant things as well. We found that most of the really exciting finds came from the northwest corner of the house, where the original roof had been replaced in the 17th century and attics had been created. And the floorboards we encountered there had either never previously been disturbed or had been lifted, but everything underneath them had remained undisturbed. This is what we typically encountered underneath the floorboards. So it was a compacted layer of dust and debris, and the finds were literally sitting on the top of this dust and debris. In some places, we found that the lighter weight finds had drifted to the top and the heavier ones had gone down to the bottom, presumably through vibrations from people's footsteps. But in some places, the dust under the floors was so heavily compacted that you could take a section through it. But what was really good about it, of course, is that it was completely dark under there and very, very dry. So the conditions were perfect for the preservation of objects. This is a little plan that shows you just how many finds were discovered in a small area. Each individual number is a find, and in some cases you can see that there are long runs of numbers where, for example, in one spot there were 66 objects found in one location alone. So immediately to the west of the gatehouse there is this attic space, and you can see the floorboards were taken up in here. And in this area, we learned a lot about how the room had been used in the past. So there was lots of evidence for activities involving sewing. So there were around 700 pins, lots and lots of needles, some of them still with thread in them, tiny little offcuts of textile, and also these documents which had been cut up into unusual shapes, which we had originally thought might be patchwork patterns. But we also found other evidence in this room for documents being perhaps stored here, including little bits of twine, which are the sorts of twine you would tie up bundles of documents, and a rather beautiful seal, and lots of little tiny drops of sealing wax. So it was possible to see where somebody had been sitting, because the molten wax had dripped down through the floorboards where they had been sitting and solidified into tiny little drops beneath them. The room in question had a good south-facing window, so you can understand why people might have chosen that space to do fiddly work like needlework and working on documents. This, however, was not expected when we carried out this project, and this was the first of our star finds, which was from the same room you saw in the previous slide, and it was found in rubble in the eaves. And it's one leaf from a 15th century illuminated manuscript with gold leaf and bright blue initials. It was identified as an extract from the Latin Vulgate Psalm 39, and it's on good quality calfskin and had clearly been cut from a larger volume. And we think it was probably a psalter rather than a book of hours because of the size of it. It's been examined by experts at the University of Cambridge, who have said that it's probably from the South Netherlands or northern France, and probably dates to the first half of the 15th century. And the fact that it has blue and gold initials rather than the more common red and gold means that it was a reasonably expensive production. And in the bottom right there, you can see just the outline of a little face attached to the letter H there, and that hints at the fact that there could well have been other illustrations and illuminations elsewhere in this manuscript. So this was an extraordinary discovery. Obviously, it's been heavily nibbled by rodents in the intervening years, but it raises all sorts of questions about what it was doing there, how it became detached from the book it had come from, and who it might have belonged to. And I rather like the idea that it might have belonged to the original owner and builder of Oxburgh. It's not a controversial thing, so we can't see why it would have been deliberately hidden, but it was certainly a fantastic thing to have found. We also found some tiny little fragments of books from the late 16th century, and these too were very interesting. Two of them were from a book called Amadis de Gaul, which is a chivalric romance from the Iberian Peninsula, which was first written in about 1420. And what's interesting about these two tiny little fragments is that they're in English. when you would perhaps have expected them to have been in French in an aristocratic household at this date. And I spoke to an academic who studied this book in detail, and she said that it's very interesting that this book was found at Oxburgh, because there were a significant number of known or suspected Catholics amongst the readership of this romance, because it's set in Spain and is generically Catholic and contains many mentions of the Mass. So in light of what we know about the Bedingfelds, this was rather an interesting find as well. We then found 4 tiny little fragments of early handwritten music. And of all the things we found, this actually generated the most excitement and interest from specialists and academics. They're incredibly rare. And they were examined by Dr. David Skinner, who's Director of Music at Sidney Sussex College, Cambridge. And he was instantly struck by how similar the notation was on these to a surviving book of around 1527 in the British Library, which contains the earliest known written source of Thomas Tallis's music. And he thinks that they could well be by the same scribe. This was quite extraordinary, given that these are tiny, weeny little objects, but he thinks that they may well be from a book of masses, sung masses, which has otherwise completely disappeared. So these are the only known surviving fragments from that book. And there's so little remaining Tudor music written down in manuscript form that these have, in fact, rewritten our understanding of Tudor music of that date. And it also hints that the Bedingfelds were involved in the patronage of music at a very high level, which is something that we never knew about the family. We also found this tiny little chewed fragment of a black letter text, and the 2 words that are visible on it were enough to identify, using good old Google, that it comes from a text called the King's Psalms. And the King's Psalms is a text that was originally written in Latin in the first half of the 16th century by Bishop John Fisher, who was later executed by Henry VIII for upholding the Catholic doctrine of papal supremacy. This particular text was reworked in English in 1544 by Catherine Parr. Amazingly, about a month after finding that little tiny fragment, in a void underneath a window, this book came out. And it turned out that this was the King's Psalms, and it was bound in this beautiful calfskin cover with 2 other texts, the Litany and the Queen's Prayers. And the Queen's Prayers was also a work by Catherine Parr. It was her translation and reworking of a much earlier text. First dozen or so pages are quite badly nibbled by rodents, but the further into the book you go, the more pristine it is. And we couldn't believe that this book, which had clearly been lying in this void for hundreds of years, could possibly look this pristine. It was printed in London by Henry Wicks, and we know now that this is the 1569 edition, of which there are only 2 other surviving copies in the world. And one is at the British Library and one's at the Huntington Library. This copy from Oxburgh is identical to the one at the Huntington Library, and both of them have prayers to be said in the time of common plague in them, which the British Library copy doesn't. And it was quite interesting that we were finding these prayers in the middle of a pandemic. It's interesting that the Bedingfelds owned this book. It would have been useful to them potentially. It has the litany in it, which could have been interpreted by critics as a sort of willingness to accept certain rites from the Book of Common Prayer. The family would have known that the King's Prayers had its origins with a Catholic author, John Fisher, and yet their ownership of it was completely non-controversial because they had the English version by Catherine Parr. Elsewhere in the house, we had to take up a floor in the gatehouse. This was a brick floor, and we had to do that because we were adding some strengthening rods under that floor to help some bulges on the walls. And our regional archaeologists came back from furlough to do this work. And underneath the floor, and it looks like an outdoors archaeological dig indoors, he discovered some evidence for 2 previous floors. And so you can see him working away in this slide. And then on the right-hand side of this slide, you can see some grooves running from left to right, which are the slots into which the original floor joists were placed. He also found lots of offcuts of wood and wood shavings and little bits of moulded wood, which appear to be 17th century in date. And so our hypothesis is that this room in the house was used as a sort of workshop area during the period after the Civil War. And during the Civil War, part of Oxburgh had been burnt down, and we know that it had to be repaired. And this was a big central space in the house, and it kind of makes sense that perhaps the craftsman would have chosen that as a sensible location to be doing work. Angus found some nice things underneath that floor as well, including some nice early stained glass, including one bit with a bit of black letter on it at the top left there, and a 16th century jeton or trading token, which he found just sort of propped up against a bit of surviving timber from one of the early floors. All of that dust that I showed you under the floor at the beginning of my talk, we felt could possibly contain other small finds which couldn't immediately be seen when we were working in the attics themselves. So we got the builders to hoover it all out and put it in hoover bags, and we stored those until such time as the volunteers were allowed to come back. And last summer, we presented them, lucky them, with 60 bags of dust from underneath the floor. And we set up a gazebo, and they happily worked away in front of the public, looking for additional finds. And they found lots. So this is a typical finds tray from a volunteer, 1 day's work. And you can see that they are tiny finds, but they're nevertheless quite instructive about how particular spaces were used. So each of those hoover bags was labelled with the joist numbers so that we knew which joists the dust had appeared from between. And so we could say that this tray of finds demonstrates that somebody is cleaning or loading guns in that space. There's plenty of lead shot. Again, there seems to be needlework activity with the pins and all the little bits of textile. There's evidence for the former decoration of the space with the paper and wallpaper, and various other little bits of incidental remnants of life there. These are some of the bigger finds that some of the volunteers found in those hoover bags, including more nice printed pieces from the 18th and 19th century. And some lovely handmade nails and lots of wallpaper to add to Oxburgh's wonderful collection of wallpapers, which could be the subject of a whole other talk. We also found a rat's nest, and this was a rather unpromising mess of dust and fabric when it was first discovered, and it wasn't possible to lift it out intact, so it had to be unpicked. And it contained over 100 fragments of silk, velvet, satin, leather, wool, and embroidered fabrics. Now, these are typical of most of the fragments from that rat's nest, and you can see that they're all pretty small, fairly nondescript, and all extremely grubby. However, amongst them, there were some really lovely finds, including this collar with its little lace tie, and also some fragments of lovely black work and some basket weave fabric with metallic thread, and a really quite sizable piece of slashed silk, which you can see in more detail in this slide. And you can see that the slashes have revealed this wonderful golden thread. Because it's so very dirty, we're actually not entirely sure what the main colour is. It could be sort of a purpley brown or a bluish colour. but you can clearly see that it's one of those wonderful bits of slash silk that you see in portraits of the period, and could well be from a sleeve. So here is an example of a portrait, just as an example of how some of those textiles might have been used. And our working hypothesis is that all these little pieces of textile are bits that had worn out and had been cut off, so that the main part of the garment, which might not have been worn out, could be reused if it was an expensive material. And what we're seeing in the rat's nest is all the little discarded pieces. But of course, the main bits that have been reused haven't survived, but these little bits that have been taken off and carted away by rats have. This is the piece that links me with Helena, because back at the end of 2020, I gave a talk online for the Warburg Institute about Oxburgh and the finds, and I put this slide on the screen and it caught Helena's eye. This is a very beautiful, finely woven collar or cuff, and you can see there's a little diamond and cross-shaped pattern in it there. And there's a close-up picture on the left here of that same textile. And on the right is another woven textile that we found in one of the Hoover bags. Now, these have great significance to Helena, and I'm going to hand over to her now so that she can explain to you why she found them so fascinating when I showed them all those years ago. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Anna. I will continue the talk. So yes, this was the moment where I came across Anna's talk for the Warburg Institute. And when she showed this, I couldn't believe my eyes. Because if we are going to look at these textiles, and especially the 2-1 rolls on the left, you can see the similarity with the pattern that Anna showed in her slide. Now, did you know that these rolls of textiles are the canvases of these old master paintings? Welcome to the story on the textile finds and canvases. There are about 250 paintings on a canvas with a woven pattern. In this slide, we see the ones of which I have recovered the weave draft. I will say first something about the tablecloths and canvases. Titian painted the supper at Emmaus in 1530, and there is a large tablecloth on the painting. The painting itself is on a plain weave canvas. And if we look at the fabric view and the weave draft, they show this. Each thread crosses each thread, both horizontal and vertical. Now, 6 years later, oh, look at this, how he painted the tablecloth. Very delicately picturing the pattern. 6 years later, he painted this portrait, Isabella d'Este, on this canvas. In the left picture, we see a reconstruction of that canvas. How do I get there? From an existing X-ray image that I kindly received from the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna, I draw on top each line and each binding point so that I can generate the weave draft. This is the graphic that has all the information we need to weave a textile. Why is it important? It's unique. Each pattern has its own weave draft. It enables us to weave reconstructions because it shows in detail how the loom was dressed. For weaving, we also need yarn. So I went to my workshop, and with this linen yarn, I put a warp on this loom, and I will show a little bit, because I'm a weaver, how the loom functions for those who are not so familiar with it. The warp threads are on a beam on the back. Then the threads comes forward to us through a series of shafts, of which we see a detail on the right, in the right picture, where each thread is in one heddle in one shaft. Then the weft, if we look again to the left picture, goes with the shuttle through the opening of when we open the shafts to get the woven cloth. Let's go back to the tablecloth. If I draw the lines on the pattern and compare these with the pattern in the canvas, they are very similar. So here again, the beautiful piece that Anna showed in her talk. I draw the lines also on top of this. And if we look, they are also again very similar. Then I tried to decipher the thread by drawing on top of it. And here I suffered, because it was as if one thread in the middle of each rhomboid tiny part was missing. Here you can see where my problem was. Where the red lines are, I did not see a thread in the textile. But to make a weave draft, where all the other parts of the textile would fit in, it only could be there with these red lines, or let's say the threads visible. So that was a puzzle for me, and I couldn't say that exactly that was the weave draft because I didn't see the threads. I was lucky that I came across a textile piece that's in the Met collection from 15th century. And textile conservator Christina Balofet-Carr made this beautiful photomicrograph in which I could see the threads by itself, very close up. Now, if we look in the middle of the picture, we can see horizontally some filaments. And if we look at both ends of these filaments, we can see as if the thread was cut transversal. Just a little detail from the above piece. There was a moment that I thought maybe the threads were on the back. They went by weaving on the back. But unfortunately, because it was a stitched part, we couldn't make pictures from the back of that textile. So in this photomicrograph, I actually found the reason. Let's say in this picture from the Met piece, there is a thread which was eaten. And I hope that one day we will make also photomicrographs of the Oxburgh Hall textile so that I can confirm that these threads were there. Here we see the weave drafts from the second piece, and they are, although it looked at first sight that the lines were the same, the weave draft is different. But if I compare the weave draft of the Oxburgh Hall, taking in account that the threads are there, it has the same pattern as in a 1600 dated Italian painting in a private collection. This painting was in a laboratory for restoration, and I received close-up photographs so I could analyze the textile. Here is the second piece that Anna also showed. I've started to look at the pattern, but we will have to make more close-up patterns and more stretch to do a secure analysis. So coming back to the weave draft, why it's so important, we already know it's unique. It enables us to weave reconstructions because it shows in detail how the loom was dressed for that specific textile, but it also shows where textiles and or canvases matches, or where we find subtle differences. A little sidestep. Before I became a weaver, I was involved in a histochemical and morphometical investigation of normal muscle and of in the mouse, and of muscles, mouse with a muscular dystrophy. I think the findings in the rat's nest and the mouse is a coincidence. It looks as if this is a completely different area. But if we look at these drafts, you can see that my love for structure, visualizing it, is still there. Here we see the paintings of which I have woven a reconstruction. And although in literature is mentioned that they are all rhombouts patterns, like the one on the left side by El Greco painting, but you see they are all different. If we do the analysis, they are all different. Now, of course, my curiosity came, are there paintings that have the same weave draft, the same pattern in the canvas? Yes, there are. Alonso Sanchez Coelho and El Greco both have a painting that has exactly the same pattern in the canvas. I do not have yet the thread count, which is the density of the threads in the Coelho painting, because so that I cannot say it's exactly the same textile, but the pattern is the same. And El Greco had a special love for this pattern, because also these two paintings by him are on the same draft in the weave draft. There was, although there was in the X-ray, I saw lines popping up in a regular pattern. And by constructing the weave draft, I could see why it happened. In the tie-up, in the right corner, is one shaft fixed to the treadle, which should not be there. So that means that the weaver, each time it pressed the treadle, that shaft lifted and the thread showed up. There is this textile piece that's in the Met collection. Then there is another piece from in the Victoria and Albert collection museum. They both have exactly the same weave draft. If we look at the thread count, 15 warp, 15 weft in one piece and 17 and 20 in the other, they are very similar. We cannot say it's the same textile, but they are very close to each other. And I have to say that I would love to go to the Victoria and Albert Museum and make also photomicrographs of that textile so that we can really compare them both technically. The weave draft is the same. And then to finish my comparisons, the weave draft in the textile fragment from 15th century in the Met collection has the same, almost the same pattern, I cannot say the same, almost the same pattern as the pattern in the canvas of Titian's Vandermeer family. although there the thread count is different. So if we have all these information on these paintings, canvases, on the weave drafts, compared and with the textiles, there's a lot of information that I started to put in a database, because the weave draft and the reconstructions became a tool for the study in technical art history. So here is the start of my database. I'm a weaver. I'm not an art historian. I'm also not a conservator, and I'm not a specialist in creating database. But I hope that the next generation, young students or researchers, will pop into this project and pick it up and go forward with it. There are questions that do not have a clear answer yet. And maybe this one also popped up in your heart, in your head. Why did painters use a canvas with a pattern? As I say, there's not a clear answer yet. There are a few hypotheses which we maybe discuss in the Q&A, but I would also really like to hear your ideas about it. And then another important question is, how and where were these textiles made? There's almost no information, written information, about how workshops were organized in the 16th and 17th century, 15th, 16th, and 17th. For those who would like to touch a little piece of the canvas, you can find on my website a little box with a few pieces, or a canvas that's stretched on a frame from 20 by 20 centimeters. I had the opportunity to give a workshop in at Yale University in 2019 in the Conserving Canvas Symposium. And I really would love to come to your places to repeat this workshop. As an alternative, you should come to Odemira. I hope to organize residencies, and with the focus on those who really would like to learn how to do the analysis and eventually how to weave it, how to construct the weave drafts. This studio is in the south of Portugal, of Odemira, and herewith I would like to thank you for your attention, and also Icon for the opportunity to make this lecture possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anna and Helena. That was fascinating. Helena, you anticipated the question about why did painters choose a patterned fabric rather than a plain weave. How do we know? We have no idea. Would it be something to do with the way that the paint attaches itself to the cloth? If you have a more textured surface or a different texture on a surface, would that help that? I mean, you have to prepare, a painter would prepare a canvas, so would size a canvas, I know, so there would be that layer, but would that help hold that layer to the canvas? I don't know, I'm not a paintings person, I just asked the question.
So I'm also not a paintings person. So yes, please, painters, come and join this project, let's say, or this study, and let's look together to it. The truth is that, what I already mentioned, there's almost nothing left written by how these workshops were organized. So also not how the painters had their canvases. I know that in a certain period they prepared their own canvases, but then studios started to work to prepare. So that's, I don't know, I can't say that. There's another hypothesis that because these are tablecloths, as Claudio Ceccaroni in his list of these 250 paintings also mentioned, he names them tablecloths. And one of the reasons could be that these are wider, so that the painters did not need a seam. And yes, many of these paintings are large paintings, but there are also not that large paintings on a patterned canvas. And until now, I have not found evidence of looms that were so wide with the amount of shafts and treadles to weave these wide canvases. So that's another big question mark for me.
And would a patterned fabric be more expensive than a plain weave linen, for example? Because it would take more time, would it, to thread up the loom?
Yes, it would take more time. And if I look at not only the Titian painting, but other paintings that have a tablecloth depicted with these patterns or similar ones, that to me, that means that these were precious textiles.
Yeah.
So if they were more expensive, also that about trade, I have not found yet evidence for that, but I'm also not a textile historian.
No. And could it be something about recycling?
I don't know. I
No.
can't. It can be. Yeah, it can be. But if I think, why should a painter, because these were painters, most court painters, why should they use, let's say, a recycled piece of textile? I don't know. I can't say. It's only guessing.
Yes, yes. There are a few questions. I'm just going to look in the question. Emma Slocum has asked, might it be that something to do with tension when stretching a canvas? Would the tension be affected by the weave pattern?
I can say that we just started with the Danish University and Museum in Copenhagen, the first tests on strain test.
Yeah.
And so the first results, we hope we will be there soon, if that could be a reason.
Okay, and we're assuming that you're talking about a linen fabric.
It's linen, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, that's also one of the things. These canvases were linen or hemp, but that's not, first of all, not possible to see in an X-ray. And also what I understood, it's very difficult to distinguish linen and hemp even in fiber analysis, because they are so similar. It's difficult to distinguish the differences there.
And a question for Anna, I think, from Sarah Kay. Are all those finds being displayed at Oxburgh with some of the commentary that you gave us? Because it's fascinating, she says. Are they all displayed?
They're not all displayed at the moment, but some of them are. And hello, Sarah, it's nice to know you're here. The manuscript page is on display. So that was sent away for conservation. I can probably pick up another question about the degree of conservation that we've done as well. So the manuscript page was sent away for conservation. It was, as you saw, very crumpled and it was very dirty, and we were worried that the gold leaf in particular was going to start to suffer. So that's all been consolidated, and it's been mounted in a double-sided mount so that you can see both sides of the page, because both sides have text on it, and that's on display at the moment. The Book of Psalms has also been away for conservation, and we were very careful not to sort of over conserve that, because it's actually quite amazing and sort of an archaeological find. The cover is quite warped, so we didn't want to try and straighten that out. And when I left, we were in the process of commissioning a display stand for that, and to my knowledge, that is now on display as well. A lot of the other finds, there's so many of them, and so many of them do still need conservation work, that we haven't yet put out many more. It could take several rooms worth of display cases. But certainly there was a plan to try and do rotating displays of them at Oxburgh. So I think probably over the next few years, the property curator there will be hopefully looking to do that.
Fascinating. And do you have an idea of how the fragments at Oxburgh were used? Are they part of household linens, a piece of clothing, or could they be the borders of a painting, a canvas? Do you have?
Yes, so Emma Slocum and Mariah Jordan, both of whom I think are on the call, both looked at the rat's nest fragments, and it does seem like the majority of them are clothing textiles. There are definitely collars and cuffs there, and seams and so on, and the weight of the fabric and suggests that they're clothing fabrics rather than anything else. It may well be that there are bits of furnishing fabric in there as well, but we haven't done nearly as much analysis on all of those little bits of textile as perhaps we could. Right. So I keep using the word we, even though I'm not part of the National Trust anymore, but you know what I mean. And I think
hard to leave it behind.
Yeah, there was definitely a plan to try and develop a research project around them so that we could understand them much better.
Okay. I was fascinated with the numbers of bags of dust that you had, actually, Anna. Because I have a reputation for collecting dust myself, mainly from vacuum bags, from cleaning dirty textiles. So nothing as fascinating as you found has ever come up in my dust bags.
There's hope yet.
No, I love that bit. And the amazing, the 100 fragments of textiles and different types of textile and leather from the rat's nest. Do rats have a propensity for liking textiles? Perhaps they do. I hadn't even thought about that.
Well, I suppose
moth and carpet beetle.
Yeah, if you were a rat in an attic and you were looking to make yourself a nest, and you had a choice of some bits of parchment or some nice silk and wool, I think I know what I'd go for. So but we have got them to thank for the survival of those textiles, because without that nest we absolutely wouldn't have them. And as I say, the bits of the textiles that were clearly saved and reused for other things have long gone, and it's just those remnants that are evidence that those things ever existed.
Well, the activities of rats have taken on a new meaning.
Yes.
And I was fascinated with the find of the Thomas Tallis music. I think that's absolutely extraordinary. A wonderful find.
It is, and I'm hoping that that's going to be written up by David Skinner, who I mentioned, who is a really leading scholar of music of that date. And he really does think that the scribe is the same scribe that wrote down the earliest existing manuscript of Tallis's music. So we can't say for sure that ours is by Tallis, but it's certainly of the same period, and could be, as I say, from a lost mass book, which are fragments of the only surviving evidence for.
Right. Wonderful. Well, let me just check our Q&A to see if we have any other questions. There is a question for Anna. Was there any evidence of historic floor coverings alongside the finds? Rush matting, for example.
There was, and I could have, my slide deck could have run to several gazillion slides, so I'm afraid I didn't include that, but we did find a really beautiful bit of rush matting So yes, there was, and I checked it with a lady who still makes rush matting, because I wasn't sure whether it was matting or whether it was perhaps a bit of like a basket handle or something else, and she was very confident that it was one of the woven strips. So if you go to places like Hardwick Hall now, where they have the rush matting in the long gallery that's woven in strips and then sewn together, it was a little piece of one of the strips, and it could conceivably have been very early.
Yes, oh, that's great. There's another one here. Do you have a number of needles compared to the number of pins? I wonder if the pins are from clothing rather than sewing, because a lot of clothing was pinned together at that time, wasn't it?
You're right. Yes, so there were not nearly as many needles as there were pins, and I think we could also do a pin project. There are clearly pins of many dates. Some of them have quite ornamental heads, which would certainly imply they're the pins that we use to pin clothing, but we haven't analysed them in great detail yet. But yes, I think you're right that they are likely to be clothing pins rather than dressmaking pins.
There's another question here. How rare is it to find this type of woven linen beyond painting collections? How rare is it, Helena? You're describing the linen used by painters.
Yes.
How rare is it to find it in other forms? I mean, we're talking about at Oxburgh that the evidence is that the linen that you looked at were pieces of clothing, possibly. I'm not sure if anyone's analysed clothing in that way.
What I can say is that there are not many textile remains. There are pieces, little pieces. I mean, I didn't say that, but the piece in the Metropolitan is 6 by 5 centimeters, which is only, let's say, this size. There are fragments in museums, but because of it being household textile, it also didn't remain, most of it.
Yes.
And I can say that the earliest weaving manual that was written is from Carl Ziegler, is from 1677. And the oldest canvas until now is from 1495. So actually the canvases became a way of studying older historical textiles.
Oh yes, how interesting.
Because they remained, they are there, and we can study them. And we have still about more than 200 to go. So
yes, gosh.
I'm curious what's coming out. Yeah.
Yeah.
And my focus is really on the recovery of the weave drafts of these patterns. And by that, try to compare them and place them in time and place them in a place where they probably were made. Maybe we can find answers, a geographical, let's say, place. Maybe we can then find answers. It's interesting that it's the scholars think that these textiles were made in the Low Countries.
Mm-hmm.
Then it's also interesting that I have only found until now one painting, and I know from a painting conservator that Northern European painters did not use these canvases. They did use canvases in a so-called herringbone textile, but not with these rhombout forms patterns.
How fascinating. Lots of food for thought and further research. I think we have time perhaps for a couple more questions, and then we have to draw a close. Anna, you touched on paper manuscripts being linked to textile activities such as patchwork. What leads you to think that?
This was specifically about a group of documents that we found that had been cut up, and they'd been cut into quite strange shapes. And we felt that if you had a document that you wanted to discard, you would either rip it in a fairly random manner, or you would just cut it with a pair of scissors in quite a random manner. But these have been cut into quite specific, quite pretty shapes. So we initially thought that they might have been used for patchwork patterns, because they were also found in the same room as all the needles and thread and little bits of textile. We had found a couple of bits of paper cut into shapes that had very clear pinholes on them, which made us think that they'd been pinned to a textile and perhaps had been used as a template. But the ones that had been cut into strange shapes, after much more thought, we're not entirely sure they were used for patchwork patterns, because they don't have any pinholes in them. And actually they can be reassembled into a whole page, which we've so far been unable to read because we cannot work out what the script is. So it could just be the case that somebody did cut them up in a rather ornamental, slightly fussy way before throwing them away. That one is a real mystery. One thing we did find, again, I could have included a slide, was one tiny bit of pinprick decoration for pounced decoration. So there was a piece about this big that was clearly for that purpose. So that was another little bit of a clue.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. One more question for Helena. Did you analyze later paintings? Is it something specific for the period that the early period you were looking at, or do these patterned canvases go beyond that?
As far as I know from the paintings conservators, and also in Mark Ziegler's book that was then translated and by Patricia Hills, writes that at the end of the 18th century, these patterns became out of, let's say, out of use, out of fashion. I have the youngest painting is by Goya, which is 1800, at the end of the 1800. I do not have the date exactly in my memory. So that's Francis Goya is, let's say, the youngest painting until now.
Oh, I see. Oh, that's really interesting.
So it was mainly, and it was mainly Italian, Spanish, and also some Portuguese paintings that are on these canvases with a pattern.
Well, thank you both. That's fascinating. We've had a number of questions, and this session has been recorded. So people who are not able to listen in this evening will be able to do that, will be able to access it. And if anyone wants to listen to it again, then they will be able to do so. So everybody, I think, has enjoyed it, and thanks you. And that's fantastic. Thank you so much. It's been marvelous.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I just want to say to everyone that our next event, organised by the Icon Textile Committee, will be on Wednesday, the 14th of December, starting at 3 p.m. in the afternoon. Heritage Trimmings, which is a company based in Derby, some of you will know well and may well have used them before. They specialise in the reproduction of historic passementerie and manufacture some of the world's finest examples. And we will see and hear about the materials and processes involved. Information will be posted on the Icon website this week, and booking will then be open. So that will be our last event of the year, and a special treat for you all before Christmas. So thank you everyone for joining us this evening. It's been wonderful. We've had lovely attendance, and I wish you well, and have a good evening, rest of the evening. Thank you everyone. Thank you. Thank you, Anna and Helena.